if you know me at all, you'll know I can't say anything in 10 minutes, but we'll see how we go. I started this presentation with a couple of quotes from the Office for Students. I'm sure many of you will have read the Gravity Assist report. That was a very aspirational and positive account of how our advances into online and remote learning might herald a brighter future, I quote them, for higher education. But I've juxtaposed that with a rather gloomier view of online and remote learning. That was part of their recent announcement of a consultation into blended learning, where we're kind of rather tersely reminded that there are no guidelines in place which prevent or restrict any kind of in-person teaching. So, I mean, there aren't many ways you can read that, really, are there? But there you go. Now, at my university, the return to campus-based teaching was accompanied by some new timetabling protocols, and these made a couple of quite surprising statements, particularly in light of the comments we're just looking at here. And they're relevant to the theme of this paper because they related to asynchronous learning. For one thing, asynchronous was, during COVID, defined as a pre-recorded lecture, and it was very definitely not contact time. Whereas in our new timetabling protocols from the beginning of this academic year, we were told two things. We were told that, first of all, and I'll quote, that asynchronous was now one of our primary modes of delivery, and two, that programs can request that up to 25% of contact time be wholly live online or asynchronous, or a combination of the two. And this posed a very challenging question to staff, I suppose. It coincided with lots of communications to students and lots of very ostentatious kind of campus announcements about the return to teaching and how excited we were to be going back to face-to-face teaching. And meanwhile, there were communications to staff that were emphasising a commitment to the student experience and heralding new approaches to module evaluation and programme evaluation and all of that sort of thing. And it must have been very clear to everyone that whilst we were being offered an opportunity to take a step into the unknown, if you like, to try out new skills and recent experiences with innovative approaches to curriculum delivery, that staff were as, if not more, accountable than ever before for standards and the student experience. And of course, that had a bit of a chilling effect, and very few people have undertaken to do any asynchronous learning now that it's been defined, or rather not to do it as part of their contact time allocation anyway. So that was really why I posed the question in the title slide. Is it possible for us to be able to teach asynchronously in a way that meets all of those expectations that students bring about contact time? So my starting point for this was to think really about, and it was a thought experiment as much as anything else, about what it is that students actually like or expect from contact time. And I suppose my starting point for this was information at my disposal around module evaluation and that kind of thing. Now, my analysis was a bit more sophisticated, and this is just my attempt to kind of represent the data in an accessible way. But as I looked at this data, one thing that struck me is how easy it was to make links between the kinds of language that students used when they talked about positive educational experiences and principles of active learning, like Barnes's that I've produced here. And now, as I say, this is really a thought experiment. I'm not making any great claims. There's no very robust research going on here. This is just really for me. It's just information for me to help develop an approach to asynchronous learning. But what was quite striking was that when I looked at the feedback we were getting from students about the online teaching and instruction that they received during COVID, that we saw very similar kinds of priorities emerge. Students appreciated asynchronous learning when it was meaningful and had purpose, when it produced feedback from tutors and from other students, and when it was sociable, when they were able to share ideas and find resources and work with students and all that kind of thing. And they were particularly positive about asynchronous learning when it was seen to be useful, personal, and practical, when they were making stuff, in other words. And so I kind of went from this and I came up with some principles. And the first three, I suppose, were grounded in as I said, the kind of things that I thought students appreciated from contact time, generally speaking, in face-to-face settings. So I thought that an asynchronous approach should be purposeful, it should be sociable, and it should be productive, in the sense that students should be producing things that could be used by tutors to provide feedback. But I also thought that students were potentially looking for some other things as well, particularly from online and asynchronous learning. They thought that it should be flexible and also personal. Now, in a 10-minute presentation, I'm sure you might want to ask me or challenge me over these kinds of things, but this was my starting point. Now, it's worth saying that the module that I was going to run this on is a level 7 module, and it's part of our PG certificate. So all of my students are also staff members, some of them new to higher education, but some of them experienced and confident academics. So so that's worth saying at the outset. But I'll just explain how the asynchronous approach worked in overview, and then I'll show you how it played out, so you can see some of the outcomes of these activities. Effectively, the asynchronous activity would be the same each time, each session. This is a long, thin module, so we met once every 2 weeks. We would have 2 hours of live online teaching, and it would be there would be an hour of contact time allocated to the asynchronous task. And the asynchronous task would play out in 3 phases. We would have a phase of create and explain. So students had to create something, and that they then had to upload it onto a forum on the VLE. I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. And they were given a template by me, which helped to ensure that when they were writing things about their creations, they were doing so in a way that anticipated the requirements of their portfolio assessment. This link to assessment is very important here. So they would describe what they had created, they would explain how they would implement that in their own teaching, and they would justify their approach with reference to wider literature and practice. And we did this every week, and over time they got accustomed to doing this. And I think probably if I achieved one thing through this, it was that they've acquired some skills in reflective writing that really help them meet the requirements of their assessment. They would then work in triads to evaluate and discuss each other's work, and then they would finally reflect and improve on their own work in response to tutor feedback. So what does all this look like in practice? Well, let's just very quickly show you this. I've had permission from these 3 students to show you their work. The triads is quite a useful thing here. I'm very mindful of Salmon's research and related research that talks about the need to sustain engagement and to ensure that students are working in productive ways. And what the triads allowed me to do is to monitor as students are uploading the work that they created, and then move them into triads so that all the students who are actively participating were always in an active triad. They were always matched with other students who are uploading their work. If I go into this triad, they've uploaded some new stuff, but let's just gloss over that. If I go to one of their older tasks here, let's say active-based learning, that was 1 minute ago, so I have to go very quickly. You can see that the volume of work that they're producing and the kind of feedback they're getting from me. And also if I dip into any of these, you can see that there's got 5 replies to this one and so on. So let's come back to the, oh, actually, good gracious, I probably wasn't sharing my screen then, was I? Apologies for that, that's an oversight on my part. Let me just share my screen. I'm conscious I might run very slightly over time. Here we go. This is what I was referring to. So this is what the discussion forum looks like, and you get a sense of how much interaction is happening here because you can see the replies and the volume of discussion that's happening. So I felt that those were working very well. Now, I do have to be very quick with this, so apologies, but the going back to the presentation, which has now disappeared off my screen. Let's just share that again. Here we go, it should be coming up. So whilst that's loading, so what I will say is that the next slides relate to the evaluation by the students. Broadly speaking, we'll just whiz through these slides so that you get a sense of what the reception was. So we can see that 8 of the 10 students felt that it was useful for their learning. We had a group of students here who were very clear they prefer face-to-face interaction. However, the vast majority felt that the interaction with peers was effective. We have, in terms of the preparation for assessment, students felt that the feedback that they had received was significantly more personal than they would have received by other means. And I will leave you with the positive comments whilst we take questions, and hopefully I'll be able to plug the gaps there. So apologies that I wasn't able to fit that in more comfortably, but there we are. Thank you.
It's a nice slide to finish on, David. I really enjoyed that presentation, so thank you very much. I think it's very clear that you have managed to actualize both Gilly Salmon's sort of socialization model into this and build effectively Bloom's taxonomy into your asynchronous model as well, very nice and fluidly. There are a couple of questions come up in the chat, which I hope you will be able to provide answers for. So first one is around participants that are non-active in phase 2 of the asynchronous model. What do you do about non-active participants?
Yeah, well, engagement was an interesting one. It followed a bit of a bell curve. I mean, a lot of things relating to technology enhanced learning do, don't they? But initially, I reckon I had about 50% engagement. And what I was doing was pushing those engaged students into triads so that they were always talking to other engaged students. And then the remaining students realized that they were kind of out in the cold, so to speak. And once they'd grasped, after the first session really, the link between the feedback they were getting on the asynchronous task and their assessment, we saw engagement go up very quickly to about 80% engagement. There were only a couple of students who weren't engaging. And then towards the end of the session, we saw a tail off back to about 40–50% because people are now switching on to the portfolio assessment itself, and they obviously feel they've got what they get. So I think the triads were an effective way for ensuring that those people who were engaging got a really positive experience and benefits from it, but it also helped to drive engagement because people really felt they were missing out on something, you know. And
it's a fantastic answer. Yes, feedback as your leverage. I know you've kind of started to answer the next question, but the question picks out a particular detail, which is you've chosen to use triads and groups of 3 rather than pairs. Was that, you know, how did you make that decision, and what were the benefits of triads over pairs?
Yeah, it's a bit of a personal preference for me. I've always loved triads because there's certain things you can do. You can create link pairs within your triads, and there's certain activities that you can do in triads that you can't do in paired activities. I mean, I'd be very happy to talk about that in another forum. But in this one, particularly in phase 2 of the exercise, it just meant that each student was likely to get quick and meaningful feedback. Not every time would everybody within the triad have something to say, but across the triad you could be confident that a student would get something constructive and meaningful by way of peer support and feedback. So I guess you could argue what the optimal number would be, but I just settled on triads for personal preference, and I felt they worked well.
I like the fact that we've come back to feedback again. So your management of the sessions for engagement was centered around feedback and the need for it, and the group work was centered around peer feedback and you promoting the opportunities for that. I think it's a great demonstration of how that can play out. So oh yes, yep. Go on.
Can I just say one thing just to round things off? Is from a more critical point of view, the one thing I will say is the workload implications for what I did. So I need to work very hard to refine my own practice. I sunk a lot of time into this, and also one of the complaints I got from students was that it was eating into their time too, that these asynchronous tasks took a lot longer than 1 hour for them to complete. I wasn't too concerned about that though, for 3 reasons. The first was that they could use the outcome of these tasks in their own teaching. They're also a platform for their own independent study. So those students who really did engage with those tasks and went further than intended and probably took longer than an hour benefited from doing so. And finally, because it's a portfolio assessment, more or less everything they did in those asynchronous tasks can translate directly into their summative assessment. So I felt that any time they spent on those tasks was well spent.